Good morning, thanks for joining us here. We're at the Flow Hive HQ and we're doing a bit of beekeeping this morning in our apiary. And what we're going to be doing today is a brood inspection. So we're going to focus on how to do that for beginners. There's lots of people around the world starting bees at the moment, and doing brood inspections is something that's a wonderful thing to learn and a really important part of looking after bees. We've got a special guest here today, Frey, who's just joined our team, and so she's going to be joining in as well. She does have a history of keeping bees at home, and so we'll get in here, we'll take out some of these brood frames, and if you've got questions, put them in the comments below. Trace, who many of you might know from phoning up our office, will be reading out your questions,
on how to do
and
that
we will get in there and
so
answer those questions as we go.
Take out.
Okay, so the first thing to do is you can have a full suit like this, have your gloves handy, and some bees are really gentle and some bees aren't. So as you get used to your hive and how they are, then you do want to protect yourself. Next thing is, it's best to do it on a warm, sunny day that's not too windy. Do as we say, not as we do. It's a bit of a grey day today, but I still think these bees will be calm enough for what we're going to be doing. This hive's in full swing yet. They are, we've put a super on, but there's really not much activity at all yet, because this time of year here and the way the season has worked so far, they aren't really building up. So what we're going to do is add a bit of smoke. Frey's going to smoke the entrance of the hive, so it's important to put the smoker, once you've got it going, blowing nice cool smoke right in the entrance, 2 or 3 good puffs, and the idea then is you wait a few minutes and it has a calming effect on the bees, which is nice if you're pulling them apart. So questions in the comments below. We're doing a brood inspection today. Any questions about flow hives or bees in general? Last week we were harvesting honey and we were talking about bees, the universe and everything on World Bee Day, and so this week we thought we'd do a brood inspection. Now this is a nice lifting point for your hive, so taking off the cover is a handy tip. There's a handle on the other side also. We can take the roof off or we could leave it on, but we'll take it off. If you've got the flow hive too, you need to undo these little wing roof locks. You can put the roof aside, and then it's a case of making sure you've got a nice clean hive tool before you start beekeeping. Give it a good scrub before you start. You can use a blowtorch or a gas flame to clean off any old wax. Wipe it off when it's hot, try not to burn yourself, and it's a nice way to sterilise your tool, because if you've got multiple hives you don't want to be sharing pathogens from one hive to another. We don't, to do a brood inspection, we would just take this box off and then start looking in the bottom box, which gets called the brood box. But it's of interest to have a little look and see what's going on in the flow frames as well. So why don't we do that? Before I do that, I'll put on my veil. Making sure the zips are done up. This one first from the bottom. So if you'd like to start pulling off the inner cover, so this is called the inner cover, and it's a case of just prying it up with your hive tool, the chisel end of the hive tool. These tools are fantastic. They can use chiseling, scraping, lifting frames, and that cover can just come off. Now we might also take out this little key access cover. Now we're going to be pulling out a frame just to see if they've done anything at all. We supered it a few weeks back, but there hasn't been much of a nectar flow, so we're not expecting much going on. None of the hives are actually bringing in any honey. In fact, they're eating their honey here at the moment. But if you're in the northern hemisphere and it's springtime, you'll probably find there's a lot of nectar going into your frames at the moment. So the flow frames, if you have a look here, Frey,
Yeah.
there's a little spot you can get the chisel end underneath like that.
Oh, yeah.
So that's it there. And the other end, you can just pull out with your hand, or you might need to use that tool to lift. That's it. Under, and a bit like you do a normal frame. And once you've got it up, you can then grab it with your hands. Here we go.
Oh, yeah.
Well done. If you're new to beekeeping, wear your gloves. Okay, so we're not seeing a great deal of action, but if you look closely down these cells, you can see they have started to wax up all of the joins in the flow frame cell parts. So there is activity. They are preparing for when there is a honey flow. We're not expecting them to start filling them. We get a good flowering with good nectar for those bees to really go and get the nectar and bring it back into the hive. So that's interesting to see them starting. And there's a couple of hive beetles there. So considering I'm seeing a few beetles, it might be a good idea to activate the beetle trap in the bottom of the hive. Sorry about that, beetle. And putting them back in, it's not a bad idea to put this end in first. So, and then just tilt it down like this. And that way you line up this window nicely, which is what we want to achieve, so no bees are getting out gaps here. But let's pull off this box, get into the brood chamber. If you've got questions, put it in comments below. We will get to answering those. So next, Frey, if you want to chisel off the box, sometimes the excluder comes with it, sometimes it doesn't really matter. So, yep, that's it. Okay, and if it was full of honey, it's sometimes good to get some help. So if you've got another person, you could lift it together. So let's just go up now. There we go. It's actually quite light because it hasn't got honey yet. And when you put it down, if you lean it up against something in case there's bees on the underside, then the bees won't get squashed. So that's a good little tip. So here you're looking at the excluder. Now the excluder is a grid that stops the queen from getting up, laying in your honey collection areas. So if you've got a flow super like we have, or any other type of honey collection box, then it's a good idea to have your excluder in place. Now I've just noticed the bees getting a little bit agitated, so what I'm going to do is add some smoke to the hive like this. I'm also going to smoke my hands because I'm not wearing gloves. It will help mask my smell. Now bees are actually clever enough to identify faces as well. It might be the reason why they tend to go after my nephew. They know who he is, they know he's the guy. But yeah, they're actually clever enough to recognise faces. So they will get to know you to a certain extent, and also your smell. So we're just giving them a moment. They got a bit agitated when we lifted that box off. Now, if you want to get your hive tool and just pry the excluder off, you start at one end and peel that excluder back. So if you're just tuning in, we're doing a beginner brood inspection today. We've got Frey here, who hasn't opened a brood box in a flow hive before. She has done, so she has some hives at home, Langstroth hives, so she is familiar with beekeeping, and she'll be learning a bit about the flow hive setup today. Okay, now you can just pick it up with your hand and just peel it now, and it should come off. That's it. Good, good. So generally movements in beekeeping are calm and gentle, except if we're trying to get bees off a frame, in which case you need to shake the bees abruptly to get them to fall off a frame. Now, I'm looking at all of these frames, and at first glance they're looking quite good. They've filled out all of the frames in the box, which is where you want to be before you add your super. So to start with, you want to choose a frame that's easy to get out. Now these are naturally drawn combs, so bearing in mind that the comb could be quite weak and we don't want to tilt it over when we lift it out. So one thing you can do, and another tip is about now you add a little bit more fuel to your smoker, because after you get immersed in your hive you can get into the situation where your smoker runs out. So adding a bit of garden mulch, whatever you have around, leaves, people use all sorts of things, even cow pats, old hessian bags, doesn't really matter to me, it's just whatever's easy. Bark from trees is often good. And now to choose a frame to pull out first, you might start with this one over here, simply because there's a lot of space on the edge. And if we add a tiny bit of smoke to where we want to work, then they bridge between frames and things like that. And in the end, you're trying to keep bees organised. So chiseling away that comb will help you to lift that frame out. And if you come in, just getting the bees out of the way. We want to move sideways just a little bit. See what's going on. So the jab and up we come, nice and gentle. And look at that, some beautiful comb the bees have built. This is naturally drawn comb, so all we've given them is a stick at the top. You can see a stick here. It's just it just goes in the slot at the top, and the bees do their wonderful thing of creating their comb. They excrete wax somehow, even though one bee might only make a portion of a cell. They manage to get organised to complete this amazing geometric pattern, and I'm not sure how they do that when only one bee is contributing to a very small part of a single cell. This dark area shows me that they've had brood in here, but there's no brood right now. So at some stage there was brood right out on the edge of this hive. And I'm looking down the cells to see if there's any little grains of rice that look like tiny little grains of rice, which are the bee eggs. Can't see any there. So considering this is completely empty, it's showing us that the bees are a little bit hungry at the moment, which rings true with the top box not getting any honey stores yet. It's a wonderful thing to be able to peer in at what they're doing and really learn from them. Every time you open a hive, you usually see something new, something different, and it's a never-ending learning journey, which makes beekeeping fascinating and addictive. Okay, we've got a few questions coming in.
Questions, great. So look, we've got to do a couple of shout outs. Fred Dunn's joined us, and he's answering a lot of questions on YouTube as well.
Hi Fred, thank you.
He's watching the live video, and also we've got Peter Cox, one of our ambassadors, and he's watching as well. So
Peter,
and I love how the community all starts answering their own questions. Okay, a couple of questions, Cedar. One of the questions that's come in is, do you ever have to take honey out of the brood box?
You don't have to take honey out of the brood box, but you can take honey out of the brood box is the answer. So if this was a full comb of honey, and often you do get a full comb of honey on the edges, you could take that out, take it back to the table and enjoy eating that honeycomb. Another reason you might take frames out is in the springtime. If you've had your hive going for a season or more, then you might want to be opening up the brood nest a bit, making some more space for the queen to lay her eggs, and this way limiting their tendency to swarm. If it's really crowded and there's no space to lay eggs, then the hive in the springtime may decide to swarm, which means half of the bees go and make a new home somewhere. It's a good idea to take a split or manage it in some way so there's not swarms taking off over your neighbour's fence and bothering people. So what we're going to do is put this frame aside. Now the queen could be on here, so I'll lean it up against the entrance. We haven't put the little comb holders. You can clip them on the side. The shelf brackets also a very nice frame rest that you can put on the side here. Now, because we haven't done that, I'm just going to lean this up against the hive in case the queen is on that frame. She can then walk back in. Because when she's in egg laying mode, she can't actually fly, so she'll need to walk back into the hive. She's too heavy to fly. So for those of you who haven't tuned in on the beekeeper.org, which is an online course we put together along with experts from all over the world, Fred Dunn has some very nice contributions to that course. So if you're interested to check it out, it's free to try, and it goes right into depth with really high quality training material with how to look after your bees in all regions of the world.
Cedar, quite a few questions want people asking how often do you reckon you should check the brood in the hive?
So that's an interesting question, and it really depends where you are in the world and also on what strategies you're using. So the best information is going to come from your local beekeepers. Here in Australia it's somewhat less demanding. People can go for many months between inspections here in Australia, but if you're in an area with the varroa mite, in the season, in the springtime, you'll be getting into your hive and checking on the mite levels and managing those mites far more often than we have to here in Australia, where we don't have the mite. And in extreme cases, in some countries say you should be in there every week during certain periods of the year to manage those pests. I'm glad we don't have those pests here in Australia. So let's have a look at this frame and see what we have and what's going on here. Now, there's a lot of bees, which is a good sign, so the bees look healthy so far, but I haven't spotted any brood yet. And I can actually see some bees uncapping some cells, and I noticed that because there was little flecks of wax getting flung off the frame. But right where my thumb is, if I scrape the across the bees here, they will just jump out of the way, and what you're seeing is the bees are a bit hungry. So when you see the cappings torn like this, let's just come in close and have a look. I'll brush those bees away, and see those cappings are torn away. That's the bees actually eating the cappings off, or taking the cappings off so they can get to the honey, because they've run out of food at the moment. So that shows they're quite hungry if they're doing that. That's their stores, and they've stored honey for times like this when there's not a lot of flowers around. And there's a hive beetle. So again, we should activate the hive beetle trap in the bottom of the hive if we're seeing a lot of beetles getting around. So keep the questions coming in, and we will keep going through this hive and just checking they're happy and healthy and that they've got a laying queen. On this side we're seeing a lot of pollen. So to have a really good look, I'd have to shake all of these bees off the frame. But have a look in this area here, and you see this brightly coloured pollen down the cells. That's the bee bread. They've brought in the pollen from the flowers, and they're fermenting it into bee bread like a good sourdough. It's always a bit better to eat fermented foods. So isn't that beautiful? You get all of these different colours, reds, yellows, whites, blues, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to see them collecting pollen. That's a good sign. Pollen is their protein. nectar is their carbohydrate. So bees like us need a balanced diet. If you want to pull out that next frame, I'll just keep this frame in the hive in case the queen's on there, and we can go ahead, lever the next one across. Well done. So once you pulled out the first frame, that's the hardest one because you've got to pull vertically upwards. As soon as you can go sideways, then you don't need to necessarily take off the burr comb between the frames. Beautiful. So let's have a look and see what we have here. So we have a lot of bees on the frame, which is fantastic. I'm not seeing any brood as yet. So I'm a bit concerned that they may not have a laying queen looking. Also noticed this hive was a little bit more agitated than usual. Could be the grey day, or it could be that they don't have a queen. When bees get queenless, they get more agitated also. So we're seeing a lot of pollen, which is good. But again, no evidence of brood on the frame yet. So we might put this back in and go to the next frame. Meanwhile, any questions?
Yeah. Questions come in, Cedar, just a couple of people on cross comb as well, if that causes a problem, what's the best way to sort of deal with that?
Okay, good. So cross comb is something when the bees build their comb, but instead of building it straight down, they build it across to the next frame. Very annoying. We're trying to keep them organised so that we can inspect them for pests and disease, and if they go sideways, then you'll need to catch that early and get them back online. If you've left it too late and the bees are built completely crossways, then you'll need to go through a process of getting the brood and then squaring them up in the combs and holding them together with elastic bands and so on. But ideally, and I rarely if ever have had to do that, is when they're first starting to build on those comb guides and hanging their natural comb, if they start going a bit wonky, you get your hive tool and you just push it back into line. Get them building on the comb guides. Once they've got some combs that are nice and straight, they generally follow suit with the rest of them. So here we go, coming up. Sometimes out towards the extremities, they start to get a bit wonky, and you can get in there and fix that up. Okay, I'm seeing a waggle dance here, which is cool. This is the bees communicating, and let's see what it does. It's doing a very small figure of 8, I thought, at the moment. Bees have a couple of different types of dances, in fact many different types of dances. They're communicating, and I don't know how they do it, but in the dark, in a hive, in amongst sometimes 50,000 bees, they're managing to get really accurate information to tell the bees where to go and how far to get their forage. So and all sorts of other things as well, like come and take some nectar from me or groom me. Well done. Look, Frey has spotted the queen and she's right here. What a star. Okay. So I think she's done a bit more beekeeping than she's led me to believe so far. Spotting the queen straight away here. Okay. Notice how she walks with bigger strides than the rest of the bees. Often that's the way you pick her up. She's also got a longer abdomen which pokes right out the back beyond her wings and is pointier. She's often less striped as well, and the shiny back plate, see this area on her thorax is shiny compared to other bees where it's a bit fluffy, and that's because she lives a long time and she wears all the hairs off her thorax plate there. So there's some good tips of finding the queen is look for that shiny back plate, and also the way she's moving is bigger strides than the rest of the bees. She moves with purpose. She's often on task of laying up to a couple of thousand eggs a day, which is an incredible feat. So the great news is we have a queen, so I can stop worrying about the hive being queenless. I'm still not seeing a whole lot of brood though, which is interesting, except I've just seen some down the bottom on this frame. So it's typical towards the centre of the hive to get the brood clustered in the centre, then your pollen and honey towards the outside. If I don't want to give this frame too much of a shake because I don't want to lose the queen. But if you have a look here, the brood is here in these cells that look a little, what would I say, it's less opaque. So let's have a look at this area here and compare that to what honey looks like up in the top corner of this frame. You can see honey. So the honey stores look like that with a wax capping over the top, a little bit more translucent, and the brood cells, you can't see through the cappings quite so much because they've got a silk cocoon in there as the bees go through their cocoon phase. Spend about 11 days in that cocoon phase with their capping before finally chewing their way out of the cell. Any questions? Put them in the comments. We'll keep
I've got a
answering them.
perfect question here actually, Seed, following on from Freya, the awesome queen spotter. What do you do if there is no queen in your hive?
So if there's no queen in your hive, there's basically, you've got a few options. One is you can order a queen in the mail, and she'll come in a little cage with about 5 escort bees and a block of candy. And it seems quite strange to a new beekeeper to order queens in the mail, but that's the way it's done. And you can then put this little cage into your hive. The bees will chew away at that block of candy. Meanwhile, the hive's gotten used to the new pheromones of the new queen, and most of the time she'll walk out into the hive and become the new queen. Now I'm just noticing the bees change tune slightly. So what we should do at this point is just make sure our smoke is still going. We might add a little bit more fuel to it, and just add a little bit more smoke to the hive. We are beekeeping on a grey day, and they are more likely to be a little bit more unhappy about that because all of the foragers at home, got nothing to do, and that's pretty much what most families do.
That's great, Seed, because someone just mentioned why the bees are a little bit agitated on such a cloudy day. So.
It's like being stuck in an apartment with COVID-19, and the whole family eventually gets a bit agitated. So just add a bit more smoke here to the hive. Give them a little moment. After a while you get to tune in with your bees, and you know when their tune changes, and you can just give them a moment to resettle.
Maybe, see, a couple of questions are coming in about, like, what do you do about ants and pests and things like that?
Okay,
and
I
also,
might just finish that queen
oh,
question.
sorry, okay.
That's fine. So there's a few things. You can introduce a queen, or you can give them the resources to make one themselves. So if you take a brood frame like this out of another hive, and if you look really closely down the cells and you can see bee eggs, then from a bee egg or a very young baby bee, young larvae, they can raise a queen. And what the bees do is they continue to feed that larvae royal jelly, and she will turn into a queen. Whereas all of these worker bees start off exactly the same, but as soon as the bees start feeding them plant proteins, i.e. pollen, the genetics change and they become a worker bee instead of a queen. So that way the bees can actually choose to raise a queen or not, and they will do so if they have the resources to. But sometimes you get into the situation where they're hopelessly queenless, the queen has died for whatever reason, and they don't get it together to make another one. And that's when you can intervene and keep your hive going by giving them a frame from another hive with some resources on it, some eggs on it. Another thing you could do is, if that process fails, we're seeing some nice brood in this area here. Look at that. That's how you want to see it. Nice hard packed brood, like clockwork across the frame. That's a healthy hive, and you know there's thousands of bees that are going to be emerging from all of these cells. So that's a good thing. This hive will boom as soon as they've got some good nectar. The queen is laying a nice healthy brood pattern there. The other thing you could do is merge your colony with another colony, and that's what you could do if they're really hopelessly queenless and you want to save those bees. You are then choosing to share pathogens from this hive to another hive, so you'd want to make sure that they haven't got any disease issues before you do that. Next question.
All right. So, yeah, a couple of people, like with ants and pests and diseases, what's the best way to deal with them? And in the same time, people saying, is that diatomaceous earth as well as the oil, because it doesn't seem sort of so messy as the oil in the tray?
So if you have a look down here in the tray at the bottom, understand what we're talking about. So in the bottom here, we've got a pest management tray, which you can slide out. Now here, we can put some oil. Beetles will get chased down through a screen, which is on our bottom board, and they will die in the oil. Some people use diatomaceous earth, which is basically fossils from a million years ago that all ground up, and it's sharp for insects, so it gets into their joints and it actually will kill them in the end. I don't tend to use that. Reason being is sometimes when you get heavy rain, it'll come into the entrance of the hive and end up in your tray, and then you've got this kind of muddy mixture happening. So and the diatomaceous earth won't work so well when it's wet. So I tend to go for oil, but by all means try some things. Let me know how it goes for you. So we might put some oil in there later, Trace.
Okay.
And catch a few of those beetles we've been seeing, especially when the hive's not a really strong hive. I mean, this hive I'm not too worried about. There's plenty of bees. They're across all the combs. But if your hive is weak, then good idea to be catching those beetles if you live in an area with a small hive beetle, which are these little black round beetles. They get in your compost heap. They came to this continent about 20 years ago. They're in most parts of the world. They're not in New Zealand, but they're in most parts of the world. Okay, so we're just going through it, and here we are. We've passed the brood nest now, and we're on to the other side of the hive. And what we're seeing here is honey and a little bit of nectar, which is great to see. So they are getting something. There is something. There often is at least something in this area, even through the winter time, which is fantastic for bees. A lot of people have a situation where they have a long cold winter and snow and so on, in which case there will be absolutely nothing for many months, and the bees need enough stores to survive that time, and that's why they store honey. For us, we can generally harvest most of the year round, at least a little bit, but you do get some months where it's not advisable to harvest because they are a bit hungry. Keep the questions coming in.
Seda, just on that last one, just you were mentioning the oil. Is there any particular oil you think people should use in the tray?
It doesn't matter, to any vegetable oil. Now, I use oil from the chip shop simply because I pick it up to run my truck on. So I've got plenty of that oil around. Used cooking oil is said to also attract beetles a bit more. They do like going to compost heaps and things like that, so it does really make sense, but it probably doesn't matter whether you use just some cost-effective cooking oil from the local store or some used cooking oil after you've fried up those chips for dinner.
So did you think that this hive would need any feeding at the moment, or?
It doesn't really need feeding. Now, I've got an example of the hive beetle here on Frey's sleeve. So one beetle has gotten out here. So for those of you who wanted to know what a hive beetle looks like, there's a perfect little example. It's just a little black round beetle, and they can be a menace. When the hive's strong, they don't really bother it. When the hive's weak, they can lay a lot of eggs in the combs, and it turns into a hive beetle home instead of a beehive, which isn't very fun, and they end up with all of these hive beetle larvae worming their way through the frames, and it can be quite a disgusting thing to clean up.
Oh, a couple of questions, Seda. Just the way where this hive is situated, people wondering, do you ever have to tie your hives down?
We have tied the hives down. Now with our classics, which we don't have an example right here, we did have a situation where when the wind would get to 80 kilometres an hour up this slope, the roofs would blow up, which only happens a couple of times a year. I said blow off rather. And so what we did with our Flow Hive 2 is we put these little wing locks on the side, roof locks, which you can screw in, and that just holds your roof on to your hive. Now that seems to work quite well. We don't have to tie them down anymore, and the weight in the hive is what really holds it down. Now there's a few caveats on that. If you've got really strong winds, then you might want to tie your hive down. If you've got a situation where you've perched it up on a table or something like that, and your hive it is quite lightweight and not heavy, then you might also want to tie it down. If you've got a solid footing, the bees are established, there's weight in the box, generally they're fine and you don't need to tie your hive down.
David's asking, the cold weather's really hit his area. I'm not really sure where he is, with lots of rain, and lots of the bees are being ejected. He's guessing it's mainly drones, but is there a way to reduce this?
Okay, so a beehive is amazing at throttling itself to the conditions. So you can get into a situation where there isn't enough nectar to go around, and the first on the chopping block is the drones, because they don't do any work around the hive. They just get fed by other bees. They're just hanging around hoping to mate with a queen one day on a mating flight, but they are not needed for the survival of that colony at the time. So they will get ejected, they will get their wings ripped off and thrown out the front. However, if you're seeing ejected brood, there could be something else going on. So sometimes you could get a situation where hive beetle larvae, for instance, could be worming their way through the brood comb, and in doing so destroying that larvae, they'll get ripped out of the cells and thrown out the front. Another reason could be, and we don't have this in our country, but there's the varroa mites can cause issues with the bees. They can bring sicknesses like deformed wing virus and things like that, and your bees may be deciding to eject some of the brood for disease reasons. So could be a good idea to really have a look and see whether they're drones or whether they're workers, and see what's going on.
Do you ever replace your brood frames?
So that's a good question. We do replace the brood frames. Now, when you're doing naturally drawn comb, there's pros and cons to it. But one of the pros is, rather than having to replace the brood frame, you can simply, for instance, if you wanted to refresh this comb with new wax in the springtime, you just shake the bees off and simply cut out right here onto a tray. You take that comb away and put it straight back in, and the bees will build on it. If you've got wax and wire, you'll need to go through that process of putting a new foundation in, so it's a swap out procedure. But the idea of replacing the brood frames would be to give the bees some fresh area, the queen some fresh area to lay her eggs in the springtime, and also to cycle out old wax. This is nice fresh wax, and it does get dark brown. It's quite normal to get really dark brown. After a couple of seasons in the hive, it's a good idea to start cycling those really dark ones that have been used over and over again for the brood out towards the edges, and then eventually out of the hive, because when you put them on the edges, typically they're not used for brood, so it's then okay to cut that comb out, and you can go and crush and strain that wax, or you could enjoy chewing on it, whatever you want to do. But in doing so, you've given some fresh ones back to the hive for the bees to then renew, and that'll be a good thing to do for your hive, both for renewing the wax and the pathogen load, and also limiting swarm tendencies in the springtime. So I've noticed the tune of the bees again. We might close them up soon, but keep asking questions and keep answering
Annette's
them.
asking Cedar from, actually a few people have been asking you, Cedar, about the smoker now that you're doing that, how you keep it going.
Going is just give it a puff every now and then and give it some new fuel. So probably left it a little bit long, but if I keep puffing it, that'll get started again. What you want is some nice cool smoke. Just put in little bits at a time and get it going. If you stuff it full, it generally goes out and you have to start again. So you want to get it going before you add any more to it. Even get some flames. Be mindful of hands, and also if you're in a really dry area, there are some rules about using smokers. So make sure you tune in with that. Nice and wet at the moment, so we're past that scary fire time we had here, which is a big relief. Close that up. Smoker can get hot, so use your gloves or your tool. And what you want to see is nice, cool smoke. You don't want flames coming out here because that'll burn the bees' wings. So nice and cool like that. And then in a case like this, where you just want to add a little bit of smoke, you'd just be drifting it across the top of the frames like that. There's no need to really blast them at this point. Just want to let them know that we're still in the middle of a brood inspection, and to keep their cool while we close the hive up. Okay, some great questions coming in. Keep them coming.
Really good ones. I'm just wondering, we may have cut out a little bit here, so I'm hoping you're still all watching. But we had a question from Tracy in Western Australia saying that she'd fed her bees with the sugar 1-to-1, but they just aren't taking to it, and she just wondered, Cedar, if you had any ideas on that.
Okay, not taking to sugar feeding. So look at that, there's a good example of the way the bees have actually eaten a whole area of honey, showing they're hungry. So you could actually feed this hive if you wanted to. I generally don't in this area because there's always something, but there's a few different methods you could try of feeding. So we have done some videos showing you how to do this. Make a quick feeder under the lid of your hive, and there's all sorts of feeders available also. But if they're not taking to it, you might want to try a different type of feeding. If they should be sucking the nectar out of that jar, if you've got some holes in the lid upside down on the inner cover area. You can also do what's called dry feeding, which is if you pour some dry sugar into an empty section of comb like this, the bees will then be able to use that. They'll bring in water and soften it and use that to survive as well. So don't give up, try a few things and see if you can get them taking to the feeding. It may be the case that they're not too hungry, which would be a good result as well.
Cedar, how often should you cycle the frames, the brood frames, or should you just, do you need to change the brood frames?
Yeah, it's a good idea to cycle out the old dark wax after they've been in the hive for a couple of seasons. Then as just routine maintenance, move them out towards the edges and cycle out some of the darker ones when they haven't got any brood in them anymore. By either, if it's a naturally drawn comb like this, you can just shake the bees off and cut out the old dark wax and take it away, and put the fresh frame back in the middle for the bees to use. So Freya's onto it here. She's moving them all back into the order they were. So that's fantastic. When you can put the frames back in the same fashion, you can get into the scenario, if you've muddled all the frames around, that the bees can't service some of the areas because there's a bulge in this frame and a bulge in the other frame, and then they touch each other, and that's when things like hive beetles can really take over, is when the bees actually can't access an area. So the frame that we've pulled out and left beside the hive actually went in over here, so at the last frame. So if we pull them all across, and sometimes a little bit of smoke can help get the bees out of the way as you're pulling the areas together.
Cedar, couple of questions about trying to encourage the bees up into the super. Different people have said things like brushing on the melted wax, but one Norm is a bit concerned that it may clog up the flow frames by doing that, and should they use honey instead?
Let me give you a quick example of what I would do. I generally do nothing, and the bees, when they're ready, we'll start working the frames when there's a good flow on and the bees have built up to enough numbers to fill the hive. But if I was going to do anything, I would simply just scrape off some of this wax and mash it into the flow frame surface. You won't damage the flow frames, but I'll give you a little example of how to do it now. So what I like about doing this is you're using wax from this hive for this hive, so you're not sharing pathogens from another hive. And all I'm doing is some wax like this off the top of the frames. When it's time to add the super, they should be building some wax up the top. And that bee's just gotten a little bit stuck in that bit of wax. There we go. Next I'll take out one of the flow frames and I will add some wax to it. Now, we did this once before as a demonstration. You can see exactly what happened. We just put a blob of wax there and they quite quickly go, that wax isn't meant to be there. It should be some nice hexagon shapes, and they start distributing it. If you have a close look down those cells, they've used it to finish forming those cells there. And all you do is add it to the frame like this. You won't damage it, and the bees will quite quickly see that it's not in the correct plate and start coating the cells with the wax. And that can be a nice thing to do. You can put it in the window and watch the process happen, and if you're getting a bit impatient, you can get some faster action from your bees on the flow frames. Once they're all waxed for the first time, they're treated like any other sticky frame. Sometimes they can be a bit slow to get up and going, especially if the season's a bit slow with the nectar. So there's a simple, easy way without having to go through that process of melted wax. Some people do like to melt up wax and paint it on. By all means you can do that. Be careful not to clog up the mechanisms, the moving parts at the top and the bottom. Just paint it more on the surface and let the bees redistribute it. It works a bit like just pushing some wax into the frame. If you could use other wax that you've got and rub it on here, or just press it in, the bees will do the same thing. They will chew it up and redistribute it onto the flow frames, and away they go.
Thanks, Cedar. I just saw Freya over there. She's taking the wax off the top of the brood frames, and a few people are saying, is that a good thing to do? Should you clean them up before you put the queen excluder back on?
Generally, most beekeepers do. The reason being is you're trying to keep your hive in a serviceable fashion. The idea that Langstroth came up with 150 years ago was, why don't we do it in a way where we can service the frames and learn a lot about bees and be able to pull frames in and out. It works quite well, except bees will be bees and they will start joining things together and building up wax where you wish they wouldn't. Now, there's different schools of thought about this. Most beekeepers will clean it off and try and keep it sort of easy to service, and other beekeepers might decide just to leave it there because the bees will use that wax for things when they need to. It's kind of like a little bit of a resource pool in case the bees need to use some wax. So it's up to you. Generally people will scrape it off and keep it nice and serviceable.
Some of the beekeepers have told some of our customers that they shouldn't harvest the honey in the first year with their hives. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, it really depends, and if you're getting that advice from your local beekeepers, you're probably in a place where there's a really long cold winter with snow, etc. And perhaps you're trying to build up a big enough colony, enough stores to survive that winter coming. If If you're in an area like this, then we don't have that long cold winter and it's not such an issue. Most bee books are written for places with snow and long cold times, so in fact most of us, we don't really get those conditions here in Australia. Having said that, leaving honey for your bees is important. So ultimately they're storing it for their survival. So if you do have a long cold winter, then follow your local beekeeping advice. Make sure you have enough stores for them, or feed them so they have enough stores to survive. Because in the end, you don't want your bees dying of starvation. However, you equally get times where the bees are booming, there's enough nectar around, there's a lot of bees in your box and things are getting really exciting. And in the springtime, the bees are building up really quickly and you can harvest multiple times during that exciting time where the bees are really bringing in a lot of honey. We get beekeepers that will harvest the whole lot and then 2 weeks later it's full again. And if you're in an area that's doing that, by all means, go ahead and harvest some honey. The flow frames do have a feature where you can just harvest a little bit, and that might be a nice thing to do if you're concerned there's not enough honey for your bees. Put the flow key in a little way in one frame that's got some honey and turn it and just get a jar of honey out. And that can be exciting for you to do, to taste those flavours coming in without really taking much away from your bees. So it's a little bit different school of thought. Typically when you're in there harvesting honey in a conventional fashion like I used to, while you're in there, because it's such a big effort to get everything going, get the processing room going, you'll take all the honey even if it's not completely capped, just because you're in there and you're doing it. Flow frames allow you to be a little bit more versatile and just take perhaps one frame of honey, or even just a part of a frame of honey, and leave the rest for the bees if you're unsure of what lies ahead. So a good little tip there.
Great.
Got time for a couple more?
Ho.
We'll put this hive back together. The excluder goes on next, and well done.
See, a couple of people asking, so how do you know now, is it okay to put that super on, or when do you know it's ready to put the super on?
So this hive is ready because all of the frames are built out, and that's a great question and one we get often. When do you put your super on? So the idea is you don't put it on until the bees have completed all the frames with their wax. Otherwise you're just giving them a whole lot of empty space before they're really ready for it, and if you live in a cold climate that could slow them down a bit. So wait till they've finished building all of the combs, and you can see lots of bees when you open the roof like this, and then put your super on. Having said that, you may not get a nectar flow, which means you may not get much action in your super for some time to come. So we're waiting for a nectar flow. I thought it would have happened by now, but the season's quite low in nectar for a variety of reasons. We had a big dry section, and it can be a bit of a cascading effect where that means the season ahead is a bit low because it takes a bit of preparation from all of those trees to get ready to flower. So what we're going to do is put the super back on. We don't live in a really cold area. If it was cold, we'd put the super on, and then it started to snow a little bit more, we might decide to take that super off again and just give the bees a bit more time with a smaller area to keep their hive warm before putting the super back on again. But in this case, we can leave supers on all year round, so we'll go ahead and we'll put the super back on. Now, a little trick here, if you remove the rear window, it's a very good handle. You've got one at this end and one at that end. You can also remove the side windows, which become a good handle as well. Generally, when you're lifting a heavy box, if this was full of honey, it'd be quite heavy. It's better to lift it at the long ends like this because the weight is closer to your body. And if you need to, get a friend to help if it's getting really heavy. The idea is to pick a time when there's no bees around the perimeter and just to place it gently on top, and then make sure it's well lined up with the box. Next goes on the inner cover, and there's been some questions about whether or not to use this plug. So the first Hive, our Classic, came out without this plug, and some people choose to cover it just with a piece of wood or whatever you've got lying around. So the next Hive, we decided to make this beautiful little plug that fits in there. Generally, I like to keep it closed because the bees will get up into the roof area, build a whole lot of comb, and that can be exciting for a few times, but then a bit of a mess to clean up after a while. So it's up to you. You can let them go and build comb in the roof if you're excited about getting some honeycomb, or you can put a plug in there and keep them all in the box below. Thank you very much for watching, and if you've got more questions, put them in the comments below. And Trace is saying there's one more question.
I've got to ask a question because they're asking really, really politely. Liz wants to know about condensation in the super, and is it a problem? And she's just wondering, she's getting quite a bit of it in her super at the moment.
Yeah, okay, good question. Now, so what she's talking about is you open these windows and you see a bit of fog, if you like, in the window, some condensation. Now, part of the reason why you're seeing that is because you have a window. Beehives conventionally don't have windows, so you don't get the opportunity to see the condensation on the inside of the hive. If you're getting excessive condensation, then there might be a moisture issue in your hive. Check your tray in the bottom, check it's not full of water. Sometimes the rain can get a bit strong and blow in the entrance. Also check your roof, make sure it's well sealed, and you're not getting a very wet hive. You don't want wet bees, but a bit of condensation is fine. In fact, bees in some cases will be using that condensation as a water source as they're bunkering down for winter. Generally, if you've got humid air and you've got a cold surface, you'll get condensation on that surface because the humid air can hold more moisture, and as it cools down it cannot hold the moisture anymore, and so as it cools the water will drop out of the air and form a little water droplet on that cold surface. So it's really a natural thing to occur, but as said, if you're getting excessive amounts and it's all wet and dribbling in here, then start investigating. You could decide to take out your tray altogether, or if you're using our Classic, take out the core flute and provide a lot more ventilation, and that will also help clear out excessive condensation. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you've got something you would like us to cover, put it in the comments below, and best of luck. I know there's a lot of people starting hives at the moment and enjoying beekeeping in this time when there's a lot of people at home. Fantastic thing to do, and in the end, if we can all look after the bees, then we get this beautiful reward